Welcome back everyone. In this video we'll be covering the rear brake replacement for the Explorer and the front brake replacement for the Explorer and City. The tools you'll need for this job are a battery drill, a 4mm bit, some long nose pliers, a Phillips head screwdriver, a 5 and a 4mm Allen key, an 18 and a 17mm wrench, some Loctite, a ratchet with a 17mm socket, and some flush cutters. Now the first thing we'll need to do is take off the fender. This is not absolutely necessary, but it will make your life easier. Now that the 4 screws are out, we can simply slip it off like this, and then take our 5mm Allen key to remove the caliper. Now, unlike the Ghost and the Phantom, this caliper is mounted directly on the forks. We can let that hang for now. We can now take our 18mm wrench and remove the wheel. So we'll hold the fork while loosening the wheel nuts to make sure the scooter doesn't fall over. We can then hold the wheel and remove this one completely. We can now repeat the process on the other side. So we hold the forks and simply loosen the wheel nut. We can then hold the wheel to do the rest. We can now remove our 2 lock rings. Now before pulling the wheel off, we want to make sure to free up our power cable from its bracket on the forks. We can now pull the wheel out and take the spacers off, just like this. We can now put the wheel on the side and proceed to remove the disc brake. We can now take our 4mm Allen key to loosen our screws. I'm now going to completely remove them with my battery drill. Now that our brake disc is free, we can get our new one. Now this is not necessary, but it's always nice to do the customer a favor and wipe down any part that is dirty. Just like that. Now when there's no directional arrow on our brake disc, we want to reinstall it the way it was before we removed it. We can now apply a bit of Loctite on our screws before reinstalling them. Now the drill is just to put them in place and not to torque them down completely. We'll do that with the Allen key later. Perfect. We can now finish the job with our Allen key. We want to make sure they're all nice and tight, but if we over torque them, it is going to warp the disc. We can now wipe any excess Loctite we have on the disc. That should do it. We're now going to move over to the caliper and install the new brake pads. We can now take our long nose pliers and straighten out the pin. Just like that. And now we can remove our 2 brake pads. Take our new brake pads and install it into the caliper. We want to align all the holes together right here. Let's do the same thing on the other side. We can then insert our new pin just like this. Now we're going to take our long nose pliers and bend it. There we go. We can now reinstall our wheel and then reinstall the caliper. Now before we reinstall the wheel, we want to make sure to put the washers back on. So on this side we had 2, just like that. And on the motor cable side we had the 1 right here. We can now reinsert the wheel into the forks. Sometimes it can get quite tight, so we just need to pull on the fork on the other side to slip the wheel in place. And that's why it's a good thing to remove the caliper, so we have wiggle room with our disc brake. While holding the wheel still, I'm going to reinstall both lock rings and then screw the wheel nuts on. Don't forget to reclip your power cable. We can now take our wrench and tighten our wheel nuts properly. Same thing on the other side. We can now reinstall our caliper. It will be installed behind the forks, just like this. There we go. Now that our brakes are completely replaced, we can reinstall our fender. Of course, for this step, we only need to screw in our 4 screws. That's how you replace the rear brakes on the Apollo Explorer. Now for the front, what we're going to do first is take our 5mm Allen key and remove the caliper. We can now let that hang on the side. Next up, we'll need a 17mm wrench, and I'm going to be using a 17mm socket on a ratchet. Now that our nut is removed, we can simply hold the wheel and pull out the shaft. But mind you, there are spacers, so we need to hold them as we're pulling the shaft out. And there we go, our wheel is free. We can now take our 4mm Allen key and loosen up our 6 screws. Now the main difference between the Explorer disc and the City disc is this one is 140mm compared to the City, which is 120. Now as we can see on the tire, the rotation is going this way. So if we flip it, our arrow should be pointing like this. We will now apply some Loctite. And again, we're not drilling the screws all the way in, just enough so they hold. We're going to be screwing them in a star pattern. Make sure you still have some wiggle room on the disc. Now that we have all 6 screws in, we can use our Allen key and torque them down. Then just like that, our brake disc is installed. The last thing to do is just remove any excess Loctite on the disc. Now, as we can see, the central channel for the shaft is a little bit off center, so we can readjust it right there so the shaft can pass properly. Before we put the wheel back on, we're going to go to the caliper and replace the brake pads. Now, the other difference between the Explorer and the City is the Explorer brake pads are much bigger than the City. So remember, the gold ones are the Explorer and the black ones are the City. Now, to remove the brake pads on the front, we simply need to pop them out of their pocket and remove them with long nose pliers. That's 1 and 2. We can then take our new brake pads and insert them into their slot. The back are magnetized, so they should pop easily in their slot. We can just make sure here. There we go. Now that the 2 pads are installed, we can relieve the tension on the caliper and reinstall our wheel. For this, we're simply going to take our 5mm Allen key and loosen the screw right here. Now that our brake line is loose, we can leave it be and reinstall our wheel. Now, a neat trick to reinstall the wheel is to first insert the shaft into the fork, install the first spacer, which is the larger one, and then we can slide our wheel in between the fork and the spacer. We can then push our shaft into the wheel, and as we see it come out on the other side, just like this, we can pull it back to install our second spacer. We can then push the shaft into the spacer and into the forks just like this. We can then take our nut and push the forks to get some grip on the nut itself, just like this. I'm now going to take my 17mm socket and my wrench to screw it back in. There we go. We can now take our caliper and insert the brake disc in between the 2 pads, and the caliper should go behind the forks just like this. We can align our holes to insert our 2 screws back in, just like that. We can then torque them down all the way, and that should do it. We can now check if the brake disc rubs, and it is indeed rubbing, so we can adjust the caliper to make sure we don't have this rubbing. Now that we've installed the new brake pads, we can see the inside brake pad is rubbing, so all we'll have to do is go and relieve the tension on the inside. Now, this is the inside of the caliper. We want to unscrew this one, as this will move the pad away from the caliper. Now, we still had some slight rubbing, but by unscrewing the 2 top screws of the caliper and adjusting it, we now have no rubbing at all. The last step will be to adjust our caliper lever. So if we turn the wheel just about here, we start to get some rubbing. So we can pull the tension on the brake line and tighten this. Now, ideally, when you turn the wheel, there should be no rubbing at all. And when we press the brakes, it should be tight, just like this. And that's how you perform a rear brake replacement on the Explorer and a front brake replacement on the Explorer or City.